Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2017. Welcome and opening.
Good morning. The Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative's Center for States is pleased to welcome you to this year's Child Welfare Virtual Expo, dedicated to strengthening assessment and decision-making for improved outcomes. My name is Elizabeth Eaton, and I am going to go over just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. If you are reading the closed captioning but not hearing anything, try turning up the external speakers on your computer or device. As you logged in and entered the virtual expo today, you may have noticed that there are several areas for you to visit and explore, accessible through the top navigation or from the main lobby. Because you are seeing me now, we know that you made it to the theater. This is where you can find sessions that match your interests. Keep in mind that we are accessible on your tablet and cell phone, so feel free to take us with you to listen to throughout your day. If you have not already done so, we encourage you to set up your profile by clicking on the My Profile tab on the top navigation. This will only take a few minutes. Your profile is where you will access your virtual business card that you can share with fellow participants as you network and make connections. It is also the spot where you can save and store resources in your virtual briefcase to download at the end of the event. Between sessions, be sure to visit the networking lounge to interact with others. And we have several virtual chats scheduled throughout the day in our virtual exhibit hall. Check out more information about these chats in the agenda under the Agenda tab on the top navigation. That will help you plan your day. Of course, if you need any technical support or assistance, you can access staff in the help desk anytime by clicking the Help tab at the top of your screen. In your current view, you will notice that there are several windows that you can move around, make smaller or larger, all by clicking on the top right corner of the window. We also invite you to earn badges by completing activities throughout the day and engage in some friendly competition with your colleagues. Just a reminder that we're also on social media today, so please use hashtag CWVE in your posts. Before I turn it over to Maggie Bishop to get us started, I just wanted to mention that we will present feedback surveys at the conclusion of sessions and at the end of today's event. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. Lastly, continuing education units are available for 5 of our 6 sessions today. Please visit the Resource Center and click on the tab CEU Information. Now, let's begin the Expo. Please join me in welcoming Maggie Bishop, the Executive Director of the Capacity Building Center for States.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning. I'm honored to be here this morning to welcome you to our 2nd annual Child Welfare Virtual Expo. We are excited to have a large audience representing a wide span of roles and responsibilities within child welfare and partner systems with us today. I want to thank each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and your heavy workloads to join the Center for States, the Children's Bureau, and your colleagues from across the country for today's event. Throughout the day, we'll be exploring ideas, challenges, and strategies related to your daily work. We'll hear thought-provoking presentations, engage in discussion sessions, and with each other and with presenters, and pack away strategies and tools to put into practice. I'd like to take a brief moment to remind you of the role we play here at the Center for States. Our primary role is to help public child welfare agencies build capacity to strengthen and sustain effective practice. We do this by sharing information, resources on best practice, helping to build needed skills, forging connections for peer-to-peer learning, and providing opportunities for tailored knowledge for individual application, all of which you'll find during today's expo. Please plan to visit the virtual exhibit hall today as well to learn more about the work we do as well as work of other partners and organizations. One of the key areas we are focused on at the center is the topic we're diving into today, strengthening assessment and decision-making for improved outcomes. Of the numerous child welfare priorities, why did we choose to feature this topic? We chose this topic because assessment and decision-making is at the core of child welfare work and directly affects agencies' abilities to achieve safety, permanency, and well-being for children and families. Agencies are tasked with making difficult and critical decisions. From the first call of suspected abuse and neglect, they continue to gather information and make assessments, not just at a single point, but at many points throughout the life of a case. Assessment is not just about safety or risk, but it goes to the heart of permanency and well-being as well. We often think of assessment in light of keeping children safe from abuse and neglect, but it also includes assessing what families need, what is needed for children to stay in their home or to achieve permanency, or for families to identify needs and to identify strengths. We also chose this topic because we know there are challenges in the area of assessment and decision-making. We have seen the field face challenges with improving child safety, permanency, and well-being outcomes from across the country. We know that the difficult nature of the work contributes to these challenges. Child welfare workers conduct assessment and decision-making in the midst of strong family emotions, high expectations for accountability, and limited time, resources, and often limited information and services. Despite these challenges, we know there is great work being done in states and counties. The session we have planned throughout the day will showcase some innovative approaches and will offer information on best practices, strategies, and resources around assessment and decision-making. Today's session will address important themes and strategies, such as sharing and using data effectively, building effective partnerships across systems and the community around co-occurring issues, engaging with families, and integrating strength-based approaches to assessment and decision-making. This virtual expo was designed with some unique features that are intended to promote ongoing learning and opportunities to reflect on and share strategies and ideas. Much like you would experience in an in-person conference, you'll have the opportunity to engage with one another, exchange ideas through discussion groups, chat rooms, and meet the speaker events. And you can even exchange virtual business cards with one another to have connective networking. I also hope you'll join the friendly badge collecting competition and be one of many added to the Virtual Expo's leaderboard. I encourage you to take advantage of the opportunities provided through this expo. To make the most of this learning experience, we ask you to be active participants. We hope that you arrive with a learning state of mind and with your profile set up for networking. During the event, we encourage you to dive in, connect with what you hear, and reflect on how you might integrate new strategies into your program and practices. After the event, we hope you'll keep the momentum going by continuing to apply and share what you have learned. You will also have ongoing access to resources provided you today on our website. You'll hear more about that after the expo. Finally, I truly welcome your feedback. Through the evaluation forms after each session, we can continue to improve and learn from our opportunities that we have today. It will help us to improve the opportunities going forward for future expos. Again, on behalf of the Center for States, I want to thank you for joining us for today's event. We look forward to Before we look forward to it, we head into the tailored services, beginning with dynamic presentations from two national experts. Our first speaker is Donna Pence. Ms. Pence is the president for Pence Wilson Training and Consulting and is with us to talk about the impact of trauma in child welfare, particularly as it relates to assessment and decision-making. As the first female special agent for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, their top child abuse investigator and trainer, author of a nationally recognized protocol on investigations, and with more than 40 years of service in law enforcement, we are thrilled to have Ms. Pence join us today. Please join me in welcoming the first opening speaker, Donna Pence.
Donna Pence represents Pence Wilson Training and Consulting. Behind her is the Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2017 logo and the Twitter handle, #CWVE.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this morning at the second Child Welfare Virtual Expo. In our brief time together this morning, you'll be presented by more issues and questions than strategies and answers. In part, this is because we are still discovering nuances when we look at the field of trauma and practice within child welfare and other related disciplines. We seek to do a better job of integrating the research into practice. And so in our time together this morning, we're going to be working through a case. And toward that end, I have a couple of reminder friends to help me this morning. First of all, I have a stuffed elephant. Now, my stuffed elephant is to remind us all of the elephants in the room, the things we don't always talk about or consider when we are looking at assessment and decision making. And so occasionally you'll see my elephant show up. I also have my COW, COW, Case or Crisis of the Week. Those situations that appear to be usual and normal, but something goes wrong and they become critical. And we want to avoid cows. I kept these on my desk throughout the time that I was conducting investigations, being a supervisor, and consulting in cases. And they travel with me always as a reminder for me. Now, a little later today, when we do our activity, you're going to need a pencil or a writing instrument and a piece of paper. This will help you as we go through and take notes concerning our family. While I recognize that many of you are aware of the issues around trauma and that you've had much exposure to training around trauma-informed child welfare practice, I'd like to make a few points for those who haven't, and also to make sure that we're on the same sheet of music. So when we look at the intersection between trauma, assessment, and decision-making, there are several things we have to keep in mind. One, the field of trauma and the research associated with trauma is ever growing. And with that comes a challenge of keeping track of the newest information and translating that into methods that we can put into practice and changing our practice to be more effective. As we examine the effects of trauma and traumatic stress, both current traumas and historical or past traumas, both are very critically important as we consider assessments as we are conducting them and in the quality of the information that we include about trauma as we do our decision making. Before we start, I'd like to provide a content alert, meaning that some of the material that I use today and some of the contents may disturb or trigger some of you who are participants, maybe causing anxiety. To reduce that, I will tell you in advance the case that we're going to be using discusses a child who has experienced wartime violence, and there's also an element of child sexual abuse that will be involved. This leads to two terms very prominent in the trauma field: psychological safety and trauma triggers. Psychological safety means that a person feels safe in their mind. They feel comfortable. They feel more relaxed. And this is one of the things that a trauma-informed child welfare system seeks to do, is to present an area where a child or family members that we're working with can feel safe. We also have to keep in mind that those of us who work in the field also need to have the element of psychological safety. We don't want to make things worse, is rule number one of a trauma-informed system. Trauma triggers are those things, including sensory experiences which may cause a person who has previously experienced a trauma to flash back or to trigger the physical or the psychological emotions that they had at the time they experienced the original trauma. And sometimes these trauma triggers are so subtle that even the person who is triggered and begins to feel anxiety, fear, threatened, doesn't realize what's causing that particular feeling to come forward. And so as we go through the day, listen for the trauma triggers when we get into our scenario. Think about ways that we could work with members of this family as well as members of the team that's going to be looking at this case to create psychological safety for the people involved. When we look at the impact of trauma on our work, we are reminded that only in the recent past have we begun to use a trauma lens to view our families and the situations that we are involved in, no matter what our roles. We also are now thinking in terms of using the trauma lens as we reflect on our own role and the way that we are feeling and the way that we are reacting in our situations within our workplace. The last issue, particularly, is one of our elephants. So I hold him back up again. This discussion around how those of us in the workplace react to, in both the short and long term, the traumas to which we're exposed by virtue of working with families who have experienced trauma and traumatic stress is one that's relatively new for us, and we'll discuss a little bit more later on. Now, what does working through a trauma lens really mean? Well, first of all, it means that we look at everything we do, every step in our process, and say to ourselves, what would I do differently if I thought about trauma? What would I do differently at this point as I start to engage with a member of the family, as I think about planning my child interview, as I meet with a colleague who has a similar history from me? What could I do differently if I thought about trauma? Sometimes when we talk about trauma-informed child welfare systems, it's not anything really big and major that we have to change. It's these small considerations, applying the trauma lens, that becomes very important to us. Now, there is currently no definition of trauma or traumatic event that is shared across every disciplinary field. There are several definitions out there. However, there are a number of commonalities between all of these definitions. And the one I'd like to share with you today comes from SAMHSA's Concept of Trauma and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach, which is an excellent reference that was published in 2014. This book describes trauma as an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. We can remember them as the 3 E's: event, experience, and effect. So these events or circumstances may include both natural disasters or man-made situations. It may be through severe neglect where the child's health is endangered. We really want to recognize that the events, they may be a one-time occurrence, or it may be a series of repeated events, not all necessarily the same event. Many of you have worked with children in the child welfare system who have been exposed to a range of different traumas over times in their brief lives. One of the things that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network emphasizes when describing child traumatic stress is that these traumatic events overwhelm a child's ability to cope if they have developed normal coping mechanisms. It elicits feelings of terror, helplessness, powerlessness, and an out-of-control physiological arousal. The individual's experience may vary as we look at how they perceive what has happened or is happening to them. How someone labels, how they assign meanings to, how disrupted physically or psychologically they are, will contribute to whether or not they consider the event traumatic. So something traumatic for you or I, to them, it is not that big a deal. For example, if we have, say, a 3-year-old who's being held by someone they love and trust, and another person comes along and points a gun at the pair, the 3-year-old may react and feel more fear from the way the adult who's holding them is reacting. Because developmentally, the 3-year-old doesn't understand necessarily the long-term consequences, what that gun can do. However, the adult does. Therefore, for the 3-year-old, the more traumatizing or scary thing is the fact that the person holding them is reacting the way that they are reacting. And then when we look at the adverse effects, that third E, this is a critical component when we talk about trauma. These adverse effects may be seen immediately or may reveal themselves over the long term. They may change as the child grows older. Examples of adverse effects are perhaps an individual's ability to trust other adults, their ability to handle the stresses of day-to-day life and the things that most of us have occur on a regular basis. They may have difficulty in managing cognitive processes, such as memory, attention, thinking, regulating behavior, or to control expressions of emotions. As we move to the workplace and consideration of the workplace, one of the first efforts put forth was by the Chadwick Trauma-Informed Systems Project, National Advisory Committee. And it was to create and formalize the definition of a trauma-informed child welfare system. And I bring it to your attention because it was one of the first. It's recently had an adaptation. But it's important to highlight the fact that this definition charges that all parties within the child welfare system need to both recognize and respond, and that response is very important, to child and family trauma. Response does not solely rest with the child welfare system. There are affiliated systems that come in contact with the same children and families. And it's not enough to recognize the trauma. A trauma-informed system must take steps to address it, including the impact of secondary traumatic stress on the involved professionals within the workforce. Further, the definition highlights the importance of the varying impact of traumatic situations on the individual. It's critical to recognize that these can vary from child to child, adult to adult, and that we need to consider the fact that some things actually promote resiliency. So it's not just seen from a deficit point of view. There are also positives that the child and family and their traumatic experience can bring to their lives. The definition of a trauma-informed child welfare system is as follows. A trauma-informed child welfare system is one in which all parties involved recognize and respond to the varying impact of traumatic stress on children, caregivers, and those who have contact with the system. Programs and organizations within the system infuse this knowledge, awareness, and skill into their organizational cultures, policies, and practices. They act in collaboration using the best available science to facilitate and support resiliency and recovery. Now let's shift to assessment and decision making. Before we go into our example, now's the time to bring out your paper and writing implement. And I'd like for you to join me in a room where a multidisciplinary child abuse investigation team is looking at a new referral. So as you take out your paper, please draw 2 lines from top to bottom of the page, which makes 3 columns, and then draw a line in the middle. So now we have 6 blocks. Each of the blocks belongs to an individual: dad, mom, son, daughter, social worker, and detective. So this is the scenario that they're presented with, the information. They're doing their investigative or assessment planning. The parents in this family have been together for 14 years, married for 10. They have a son who is 9 and a daughter who is 5. The referral was made by a concerned sibling of the mother. The sibling has seen the father slap both children across the face when he's angry with them for being disobedient. The mother seems to do nothing to interfere or to act to protect the children. In fact, her punishment for the children frequently is to withhold food and lock them in a sparsely furnished room within the house. Much of the time, she seems to ignore them. The son has gotten into trouble at school for aggressive acts with other children. He has had outbursts in the classroom, which the teacher has had trouble handling. The daughter, on the other hand, is quiet, seems sad much of the time. Regressive behaviors are demonstrated, such as thumb sucking and occasionally still wetting herself. The siblings tried talking to the parents about the behaviors, but nothing seems to change. So now she's called the Child Protective Hotline. She also describes both parents having used marijuana and sometimes illegal street drugs. She thinks the father may have been arrested before, but isn't sure. The dad has only his mother and sister living in this country with him, and our sibling knows that he is from a foreign country, but knows very little else about his background. Now, with this information, what have you noted in your blocks as you've listened? Where might there be points that have connection with trauma that we need to look at? During this discussion, our CPS worker says that there have been 3 prior referrals on this family, 2 for general neglect, which came up as unsubstantiated, and 1 as inconclusive. The father has an arrest history, according to our law enforcement officer. When we look at this information, what else might it say to us? The CPS worker also shares that our mom, as a child, had 2 CPS referrals for child sexual abuse, with the father listed as the offender. First time, it was ruled unfounded. Second time, the father was arrested and it ended. Unfortunately, our time together is over, and this is a cliffhanger. So going to the chat room will be the way we can follow up with this situation. In conclusion, I appreciate your time and being with you today. There is much more to cover on this topic. Thank you.
Maggie Bishop speaks.
Thank you, Donna. That was an amazing, insightful, and extremely helpful conversation. Now, I'd like to have the opportunity to introduce our second guest speaker. I'd like to introduce Oronde Miller, who will highlight for us the impact of agency decision-making on child and family outcomes. Mr. Miller has over 20 years of experience working with organizations helping to promote improved life outcomes for their children and families. He currently serves as program officer at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where he is a member of the Racial Equity and Community Engagement team. Please join me in welcoming Oronde Miller.
Oronde Miller is with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation.
My background is actually as an educator and a psychologist, though, which I'll note because it shapes the way I think about these dynamics. So it's not as a trained social worker, but it is as somebody who thinks and tries to really kind of think deeply about these dynamics of child development, family socialization, and how we engage with this nation's kind of large systems. And so just wanted to say that as a part of the backdrop. The other thing I'll say, and I'll just ask that you give this initial question some thought, this initial theme. And so the initial theme that I'd like to get you to reflect on is, what do we lose as a system, as a field, when we don't effectively engage families in the service planning and the decision-making process? And so what do we lose if we don't do that work effectively? So just ask that you give some thought to that as we begin and continue. First thing I'd like to kind of start with is just sharing some more of my own personal experience. And so some 40 plus, some people would laugh at that, but I'll just say 40 plus years ago, I was actually, and my brother, we were both children, similar to the many that you work with and engage with every single day, in terms of trying to support them and their families to be more healthy and well. And so we were born in a rural part of Ohio back in the early 1970s. And so to an interracial couple, mother's white, father's black. And when our birth mother got pregnant with our brother, she was given an ultimatum by our family and told that that wasn't acceptable with the family. And she had to make a decision to either have him and give him up for adoption, or she would no longer be welcomed in the family. And so she struggled with that decision, but at the last minute decided to keep my brother and try to take care of him. She got pregnant with me shortly after, same father. And when I was born, similarly tried to keep us and take care of us. But after the first few months, she decided she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it with the kind of support, or maybe the absence of support that she had or didn't have, and said that she wanted something better for us. So she actually took us to the Department of Social Services, placed us in foster care with just one request. And that request was that the agency commit to keeping us together and find us a home where we could always stay together. And so we were in a couple foster care placements in Ohio, at one time separated, and eventually we were placed with an adoptive family through Homes for Black Children in Detroit, Michigan. So our story, I will say overall, is a very, very positive and encouraging story. I also should say that my purpose in sharing some of this experience is not to say what agencies necessarily are horrible at, or necessarily what agencies are effectively strong at. I would argue that child welfare agencies, by and large, are capable of the potential to be very, very effective at some things, and also very, very ineffective at some other things. And most of the time, we spend our days somewhere in between, really doing some things well and doing some things not so well, but trying to get better. I also like to share another part of our experience, which is, it really speaks to the lifelong implications of the decisions that many of you make every single day as caseworkers, as supervisors, as attorneys and judges, making recommendations and final decisions about children and their families and their placements. And so it really has to do with placements and how we come to those decisions. And so some 30 years after we were placed, and we were both adults by then, my brother was actually diagnosed with late-stage cancer, with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He went through a series of aggressive treatments early on. It was already pretty late stage, and so they started with some of the most aggressive treatments that they had. He also went on, after some of those didn't really work so effectively, he went on to take on some experimental treatments that they were just beginning and wanted to find out if they were effective, particularly in treating some of the places where his tumors were the largest. Went through some of those, and in the beginning there was hope, and over time those also didn't pan out very well. So at that stage, the doctors came into the hospital room and they started to talk about hospice care. And it just came up in the conversation that his chances would have been a lot greater when they looked at donor registries for potential bone marrow transplants, that his chances would have been a lot greater if he had relationships with biological family, and particularly a sibling. And they didn't know that I was his sibling to the same birth mother, birth father. They assumed that since he was adopted, that I was not a birth relative. And so as soon as that came up as an option, it just opened up a number of new doors. And so at that stage, I got a couple tests done. The first ones, they wanted all the markers on the blood cell to come back as a match, and they didn't. We did it again. And at that time, all the markers came back as a match, and it opened up the possibility of me being a donor. So sent the information in, and actually did it twice. The first time it didn't take, and the second time it actually gave my brother an extra 10 years of life. And I say that, some people talk about that as a gift to him, but it was really a gift to me, because it was during that last 10 years that I really understood, I think in a deeper way, about what it meant to have siblings in your life, the importance of those relationships, some of the next stages that we went through in terms of finding our birth mother and birth father. But I'll also say, just for me, some of the life lessons about courage and about determination and about really how to live a life on purpose. Had we not had those extra 10 years, I wouldn't have had that experience with my brother and being able to learn from some of those lessons that he was able to teach me. Now, the next thing I'll come back to is just this idea. One thing that I've come to appreciate working in the field is that child welfare systems are particularly great at some things, and as I said before, not so much at others. And so in our experience, as we reflect, we have this particular agency that was really, really effective in keeping siblings connected. They were committed to keeping siblings connected, committed to finding adoptive placements, and particularly at that time, even for young Black children, and keeping them connected in their placements with adoptive families. At the same time, we had a system that when our birth father and his family came to the agency to find out what they could do, if they could get us back, they were turned away. Rather dismissively, as I understand the story. And so just as effective as they were committed to keeping siblings together, they were just as dismissive, and I'm sure some of that had to do with race, just from some of the story that we've heard, but just as ineffective in terms of engaging fathers and trying to figure out this dynamic of race and how their system responds and engages a diverse set of families. And so I think it's important for us to realize that all of our child welfare systems are really a work in progress, and you all are out there trying to do this work every single day, which I certainly celebrate and applaud you on, and look forward to getting back into at some point. Every day, you all are charged with making decisions that impact families, and just as is our particular instance and experience, as it is for others across this country every day, you all are trying to use all the information that you have available. And I just want to add that you have a whole reservoir of information and wisdom and perspective to really tap into. And so in our particular instance, there wasn't a lot of engagement with family. There appears not to have been a lot of support offered to our birth mother to figure out if there was some way that supports could be offered, either to try to heal and mend some of the family relationships as it related to race and family and children. and certainly in terms of building a relationship with our father and the paternal side of the family to find out if he was a resource and or if other parts of his family could have been resources for us. But there was a whole reservoir of kind of resources available that the agency at that particular time didn't necessarily tap into. But you have access to that, and many of you draw on that every single day. And I just want to highlight some of those themes as we continue for the next few minutes. Just reaffirming that families, extended families, grandparents, cousins, uncles, aunts, and the like are extremely valuable resources in trying to find out what the best plan is to provide for the care, support, nurturing, and well-being of children when they come to the attention of our child welfare systems. They bring more perspective and insight about what some of the history is in the family, what some of the experiences have been, some of the immediate presenting circumstances that have come to the attention of the child welfare system. The extended family members, whether they be grandparents, uncles, all of them, can shed some additional insight on what some of the circumstances are, both in the immediate family unit as well as in some of the surrounding context. So we have to reach out, get some of that perspective, tap into some of that additional perspective and insight as we assess what the conditions are and find out what some of the options are in terms of providing support to the family. It also helps us to understand what accounts for some of the parents' actions. And so we find often when parents come to the attention of our systems, parents can be angry, and rightfully so oftentimes. Parents can be extremely frustrated, can be afraid. And so that's what we're working with. That's what we're trying to understand. And other people can help us to figure that out. Sometimes it makes perfectly sense if a family's come to the attention before, has gotten minimal support, but has tried to find some way of getting things together, but has not been able to do so, not been able to find resources to help in that process. It makes sense that parents will be really angry and upset, be it the mother or the father or whoever else it is in the family that's coming to our attention. And so anyway, the family relationships and us being able to tap into that, it helps us to make sense of that and figure it all out. It also opens up other possibilities in terms of placement resources. And that could be, again, relatives, it could be coaches, it could be other close friends of the family, but we just have other options that we can bring to the table if we open up the process a little bit more. And the other thing that I'll say is that the process also opens up the opportunity for public child welfare agencies and private service providing partners to actually develop partnerships with the families and help to heal some of the family dynamics that have been eating away at the family over time. And it's only when we open up the conversation, when we find out what some of the history is, that we can actually begin to peel back some of those layers and actually serve as a healing force for the family. That might mean that the child ends up going back to with the parents of origin, birth parents, or it also might mean that the child needs to be placed with another relative. But in doing so, we at least create the conditions that make it much more likely that the family is going to partner together and provide the kind of reinforcing supports and nurturance that the child needs, as well as some of the ongoing family relationships. And those are some of the things that we have to continue to try to pull for and push for in our work. Something else that I'd like to spend a little bit more time on, especially in the context of family, is this power dynamic. And so we have examples from around the country. Many of you all are doing this work every single day. And so one of the things that I've learned, one of the things that I've seen and experienced is that this work is most effectively done when we're able to create a condition to facilitate a space, open up a space where we actually acknowledge and neutralize some of the power dynamics that are a natural part of the engagement between systems that have the legal authority and the responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of children, and the family, who's often experiencing this as a punitive intervention or outreach from the agency. So doesn't necessarily, they don't see themselves necessarily as customers in receipt of services, but as a family or an entity being kind of imposed upon by an agency making judgments of them. And so, but acknowledging and opening up a conversation about what that power dynamic is, and it's also directly influenced by the history and current reality of race and racism in this country. So families of color, especially who are living in communities that are that don't have access to resources, that often have punitive interactions with a lot of our nation's public systems, they're going to see that relationship not as a service providing relationship necessarily, but as a punishing relationship. And so we have to acknowledge that at the very beginning, when we open up the space, when we kind of facilitate the space for this family and agency partnership, so that families can actually begin to drive the process. And so what does that look like? There are folks that are doing this work every single day. You all, many of you all are doing this work every single day. So that looks like preparation work that's happening on the agency side, where the agency is making clear what its concerns are about the families. It's doing some initial outreach and preparation work with the family, letting the family know what this family engagement process is intended to do, what the agency's concerns are, what the range of options are that are available, what the final decision-making authority looks like, so that the family knows what they're working with and what to expect when they kind of enter into the process. I'd also say that it's having a very clear conversation sometimes about the prior interaction that the agency has had with the family. And sometimes that means acknowledging when the agency has not necessarily stepped in and provided as much support as could have been helpful for the family, which sometimes at least contributes to the maybe family coming back to the attention of the department. But whatever the dynamics are, it's just important to put it all on the table so that there's an open conversation about what the current concerns are and what some of the needs are and challenges of the family in as open a way as possible. I think it's also important, and we've seen examples of this in some states across the country, the facilitators of those processes should be folks that families trust, that they have some level of confidence in, some level of neutrality in the sense that the facilitator doesn't have a stake in making the final decision, but is actually trying to guide the process so that families feel heard, so that children are taken care of, and so that the agency is able to identify the kind of supports that are needed and then move forward. But having some sort of facilitator, and oftentimes that can be somebody connected to a religious institution, if it's a church or if it's a mosque or whatever the case may be, but having somebody that the family trusts. It may also be somebody connected to a community-based organization that are prepared to be facilitators and understands what the dynamics are. But it's just really important to kind of get at that power dynamic, and having a neutral facilitator in that role can be really, really helpful. And then caseworkers who, kind of bring that set of values is also extremely, extremely important in the process. Last thing I'll say is, in those spaces, and it may be in the context of a meeting, it may be in the context of when families see that something's not happening or there's not follow through, and that can be either on the family side or on the agency side, some other kind of supports are needed, but always having space to call a meeting, to bring everybody back together, maybe the public agency, maybe private providers, maybe coaches, maybe folks at the recreation center, whoever it is that can form a team around that family, but having the ability and space to bring folks together whenever it's helpful in order to keep the process moving and provide the family with the kind of supports that are needed. And so all of this is important in terms of facilitating, effective family engagement. The other thing that I'll say is that this process can actually be a support, as you all have experienced, as I continue to learn, to caseworkers, in the sense that the agency has the legal responsibility to make sure that the child remains safe. But the agency doesn't have to do it all, and the agency can't do it all. And so having other family members who are actively supporting in terms of connecting parents or other family members to appointments, if they're assessments or therapy appointments or whatever the case may be, helping them get connected to housing resources, in partnership with the caseworker, but having that kind of active support is always really, really helpful. And it helps to take some of the responsibility off of caseworkers who have 101 other things that they're responsible for, sometimes even with the same children that are part of that particular family experience or case. And so anyway, it can really be a support to caseworkers if that process is done and managed effectively. In places that have done this work and have really kind of had effective family engagement processes in place, we've seen decreased time in care, we've seen increased access to relative placements, and shorten time to reunification or other permanency options if it becomes necessary. But anyway, it really can have a direct impact on improving outcomes. And we see that some of those are continuing challenges for systems across the country. Another thing that I'll say is that what also shapes some of this experience is making sure that there are services and supports that are actually available and present to support the families along the process, because one of the biggest things that can undermine the families that are taking an active engagement, active interest and investment and trying to work through the family dynamics and the care for the child is not having access to the supports and what have you that are needed. And so I think about these things as the 4 A's, if you will. And so we think about, are the resources available? Are the supports that the family needs, are they actually available? Do they exist? Are they accessible? Whether it has to do with hours, accessible by transportation, does a family have the kind of transportation they need to get to them? Are they appropriate? Are they really going to respond? Does that service provider have a history of kind of effectiveness engaging with family, either a particular kind of racial, ethnic, cultural background? Maybe it has to do with language and the like. And then the last thing I'll say is affordable. And so sometimes the most effective supports and services that are out there are not affordable to families, and families are responsible for getting those, getting access to them. So just have to be mindful that those are actually present and that families have the ability to get connected to them. The last thing, I think the last major theme that I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about is the engagement of fathers in the service planning and decision-making process. And so this is probably the piece of the work that's probably most personal to me, just given my own experience with my brother and family. And so I come in, acknowledge at the very beginning that agencies, caseworkers have particular challenges trying to identify fathers in some particular instances. And so that part of the work is very, very real. I'll also acknowledge that given the history and evolution of the field, oftentimes child welfare systems are immediately thinking about the mothers that are involved with the children. And so that's part of the history and backdrop of our field, and it continues to kind of stay with us today, certainly many years after we had our particular experience with the system. But we see this, we see it in the Child and Family Service Reviews, we see it in quality service reviews that are being done all the time and assessments of child welfare systems pretty consistently. And so just want to say, share some just reflection on some things that I've seen in some systems around the country. And so there was one particular agency, we've seen something like this in different places, but one particular agency I and some colleagues were working with and partnering with. We've been doing some work with them around race, understanding the influence of race, ethnicity, culture, history, and kind of current reality of racism in this country and its impact on the agency. And after we've been doing that work for a while, we actually had a conversation about fathers, and there were a group of caseworkers that slowly, but they eventually acknowledged that they are hesitant at best and fearful in terms of going out, identifying, and having meetings with the fathers. And so they, in some cases, avoid having to engage with the fathers, and if the fathers are present, they don't necessarily engage them in the active conversation about what's happening with the children and what's happening in the larger family. So once that conversation was opened up a little bit, it actually provided a lot of opportunity for us to actually bring in fathers to share what their experiences have been with the child welfare system, how they experience the engagement process. And then it also gave caseworkers in this particular instance an opportunity to talk about what their assumptions were, what their hesitance was, what their fears were. That led to the creation of an advisory group of fathers that continue to work with and participate in trainings with the agency, expose other caseworkers and also private providers about what some of these dynamics were. And it really opened up a different way of thinking about fathers, the experience of fathers, and their involvement in the child welfare kind of assessment, service planning, and decision-making process. It changed the culture of the agency. It created some of the kind of obvious improved outcomes that they were looking for in terms of paternal, so placements with fathers, with paternal relatives, decreased time in care, and the like. It's not necessarily easy work, but it's so important work. And there are folks out there, many of you who are a part of this discussion today are doing this work every day. And so we need to spread that really important work. The opening thing that I talked about at the beginning was, what do we lose when we don't engage families effectively in the service planning, the assessment, and the decision-making process? I actually like to close with another take on this theme. So I actually ask, what do we gain when we do effectively engage families in the service planning and the assessment and the decision-making process? I would argue that we gain a piece of our own humanity back, because we actually see the humanity in families that we've not fully engaged and that we have real questions about in terms of their ability or even commitment to caring for their children. We gain a sense of our own humanity by effectively engaging them and learning, tapping into the wisdom that exists within that family. I would also argue that we see what families are really capable of, sometimes with our agency's support. And then I'd also add that we also rekindle the fire, oftentimes, that got us involved in the work in the first place and gives us a new sense of confidence about what the possibilities are of our field, of our interactions with families on a day-to-day basis, in our careers and work moving forward. And so I thank you for all the work that you do. I thank you for all the work that you'll continue to do, and look forward to future partnerships and just collectively all of us getting to the kind of outcomes that we want to see for all of our children and families. So thank you.
Maggie Bishop speaks.
Thank you, Oronde. Thank you for your personal story, and thank you for your insights. I also want to thank you and Donna for helping to kick off today's event. Your presentations were amazing and extremely insightful, gave us a lot of things to think about. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentations and that they gave you the opportunity to reflect on important issues and implications surrounding assessment and decision-making in particular. And I hope you're excited and motivated to dive into the rest of the day. Before our next session, we have scheduled a networking break. We invite you to join this morning's speakers and representatives from the Capacity Building Center for States, Tribes, and Courts to chat about available resources and services to support your work today. In a moment, your screen will change and you'll be automatically directed to the exhibit hall to network, chat, and access resources. Please be sure to stop by the individual booths for the Centers for States and Tribes and Courts to chat with speakers and center representatives. Remember that you can save resources from the exhibit booth to your virtual briefcase to download and review following the Expo. At 11:30 Eastern Time, you'll proceed to the Expo's first set of concurrent sessions. One session is a workshop tailored for managers and administrators to look at effective ways of sharing and using data. The other is a skill-building seminar for frontline workers around safety decision-making. You'll receive an announcement when it's time for these sessions. Join us back here in the theater and select the session that best matches your interest and role. Workshops are listed under the tab titled Managers and Administrators, and skill seminars are included under the Frontline Workers tab. Don't forget to take the time to ask questions and to share your thoughts through the features that have been provided for that purpose: group chats, meet the speakers, and events and virtual reflection activities. Thank you again for joining us for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo, and I truly hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all very much.